Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Cornetta, President of your Board of Directors, and I want to thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar on the changes to our governing documents and for allowing this panel to explain the reasoning behind the changes and the safeguards protecting your rights as members. In normal times, we would have hosted a series of forums to discuss these document revisions. However, the COVID-19 pandemic precludes such in-person group events. This webinar is a substitute. While we've had numerous Zoom meetings in the last 2 months, this is actually the first webinar we've attempted. So please be patient with us as we adapt to this new way of communicating with members and fine-tune our skills. Our panel consists of Board Vice President Tappy Phillips, Treasurer Roger Saunders, Board Member Jim Moore, Ad hoc Committee Member and Rules Committee Chairperson Chris Jackstad, and Finance Committee Chairperson Lynn Anderson. The agenda will cover why we chose to update the documents and the process and timelines we followed. And we'll also discuss annual assessments, board spending authority and controls, vote thresholds, petitions for special members' meetings, and at the conclusion, we'll answer a few questions from members. If you're using an iPhone, an iPad, or a computer, just click on the Q&A in the screen controls at either the top or the bottom of your screen and enter your question in the text box. Questions not addressed in the webinar will be answered on the Foxfire webpage, which can be found at foxfirecc.com. That webpage already has answers to a number of questions previously asked by members over the last month. We'll begin with Tappy Phillips, who will discuss why we chose to update the documents. Tappy.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to everyone who's listening in. So why amend the documents? The short answer is it was overdue and we needed to revise them. The last document revision was in 2007 and things have changed since then. This board and previous boards have made updates to comply with Florida state law, but it had become something of a patchwork and needed to be completely rewritten to be in a comprehensive form. The board worked together with the Ad hoc Documents Committee and with our attorney. We did 5 versions before we were satisfied with the documents we have presented to you. This version is in compliance with Florida state law, but there are several changes that are not mandated by law, but we believe update the board's operations to reflect the reality of the times. We will get into each of them in more detail individually later in the presentation. But as an introduction, some of the significant changes are: change the authority of the board to impose a special assessment. The new documents say that a member vote is required if a special assessment exceeds 6.5% of gross revenue and capital contributions. Raise the percentage of members who can call a special meeting. Adjust the number of votes required to pass a special assessment to a majority of those who actually participate and cast ballots. Increase the limit on annual assessments, which we know as the quarterly maintenance fees and capital contributions, from 6 to 6.5%. We believe these changes protect members from unexpected expenses. It gives these and future boards the flexibility to allocate resources and respond to future needs. And it more realistically protects the rights of members who choose to vote for issues. Next, we're going to hear from Chris Jackstad, an attorney and a member of the Governing Documents Ad hoc Committee. Chris.
Thank you, Tappy. Good afternoon, fellow Foxfire members. My name is Chris Jackstad. I am the chair of the Foxfire Rules Committee and a member of the Ad hoc Committee for the revision of the governing documents of Foxfire. You have just heard Tappy Phillips, our vice president, explain why it is necessary to revise our governing documents. I will spend a few minutes talking about the process of revising the documents and the timeline that went through in order to do that. Over a year and 1.5 ago, in late 2018, the board started discussing revising the governing documents for the reasons Tappy has just discussed. On January 18th, 2019, the board approved starting to revise the governing documents. On February 15th, 2019, the ad hoc committee was formed, and that committee consisted of Director Mark Schwab as chair and Director John Hauk. Between March 18th of 2019 and May 18th of 2020, at least 18 separate meetings were held involving the committee, the board of directors, and/or Stephen Falk, the attorney for the board. All of this information is available on the Foxfire website for you to take a look at, and I would ask you to do so at your leisure. However, I would like to discuss just a few of the pertinent dates during that time period. On March 25th, 2019, the ad hoc committee met with Attorney Falk, and it was decided unanimously at that time that it would be necessary to produce a whole new set of documents due to the fact that striking and underlying would cause more confusion and would be harder to understand. That particular idea is found in Statute 720, which does provide for that to happen. In the new documents, you will see that substantive changes between the new documents and the old documents are in italics. And with respect to statutory changes, those are bolded. On June 21st, 2019, the board was updated on the progress that the committee was making. And on August 26th, 2019, the ad hoc committee discussed its final changes to the documents. Finally, on December 10th, 2019, at a very long special meeting of the board of directors, the documents were reviewed line by line with each director, committee member, and other folks as well, making suggestions and comments as to the revisions. Finally, on May 18th, 2020, the current documents that are on the website were approved by the board of directors, and the process of submitting documents to the members for approval was started. The very next day, on May 19th, 2020, a PowerPoint detailing the proposed revisions to the documents was posted to the web. A day later, on May 20th, 2020, a complete set of the documents, letters from the board of directors, and Dr. Cornetta explaining the revisions were posted to the Foxfire website. Again, I would recommend that you take the time to look at all of those documents at your leisure. This, on June 16th, 2020, answers to questions previously submitted by the Foxfire members were posted to the web. Today, we are having our informational webinar meeting. On or about July 15th, 2020, it is anticipated that the ballots, proxy, and explanations will be sent out to the members, with the deadline for receipt of ballots August 31st, 2020. Thanks for your attention this afternoon. Please submit any questions you have, and if we are unable to get to them today, please check back at the website as we will try to answer all questions asked. Please read and review all the documents and explanations. Most importantly, please vote. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lynn Anderson, the chair of the Finance Committee.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, neighbors. I am Lynn Anderson, chair of the Foxfire Committee, and I am going to discuss the annual assessments. Annual assessments represent the per year membership cost of the Foxfire Homeowners Association. Members are billed quarterly for their share of maintenance fees and capital contributions to the reserve funds, which are currently the Capital Repair and Replacement Fund and the Capital Improvement Fund. The current annual assessments are approximately $5,800 per member and $5.4 million in total for Foxfire. The bylaws limit the amount by which any board can increase the annual assessments each year. The maximum a board can increase annual assessments in any 1 year is determined by a percentage of a base, which includes revenues and capital contributions. The proposed bylaw 6.5 increases the percentage from 6 to 6.5% of budgeted gross revenues and budgeted capital contributions for the preceding year. Although prior boards had the ability to increase fees 6% of the base, the actual average increase over the past 10 years was 2.4% of the total annual revenues and contributed capital. The 2019-20 budgeted base is $8.2 million, which consists of approximately $7.1 million of gross revenues and $1.1 million of capital contributions. Using the proposed 6.5% of the total prior year budgeted revenues and budgeted capital contributions, the maximum allowable increase for next year's annual assessment is approximately $530,000. The actual proposed increase for next year is approximately $187,000. The $187,000 I just referred to represents 2.3% of revenues and capital contributions, which I'm calling the base. The per member increase from last year is approximately $200, or a 3.5% increase from the prior year. This is the lowest annual percentage increase Foxfire has had in the last 5 years. The actual 10-year average year-over-year increase was 3.8%. Foxfire compares favorably to our peer Southwest Florida SERAs, which are other bundled communities like Foxfire. The most recent information we have to compare ourselves to our peers is from the year ended 2019. And the total cost to members for our peers was $9,420 per year per member for the year ended 2019, which compares to Foxfire for next year's proposed dollars of $5,998. So Foxfire's proposed assessment for next year is 64% of the average SERA in 2019. It's also necessary to point out that the majority of SERAs only have 18 holes of golf. So to compare apples to apples, it's important to add back the cost per member of those additional 9 holes that Foxfire has to make a fair comparison. So the total member cost of SERAs would be over $10,000 compared to $6,000 for Foxfire. So in summary, our annual assessments again are a combination of maintenance fees and capital contributions to reserves. Although prior boards could increase the annual assessment 6% of the total gross revenues and capital contributions, they actually increase it on average 2.4%. Annual assessments, or the membership cost of the Foxfire HOA, is significantly lower than our Southwest Florida bundled community peers. The annual assessment history demonstrates prudence by past Foxfire boards. Changing the maximum annual increase from 6 to 6.5% of total gross revenues and capital contributions should not change that fact. Members should feel comfortable approving this change. Thank you for listening, and I'm now pleasure to introduce Roger Saunders, Treasurer.
Thank you, Lynn. For those of you who are taking notes, Lynn's comments tied to Covenant 2.1 and bylaw 6.5 in the current statements from 2007. She's provided us with some very specific and important figures about fees for maintenance and capital funds. Revenue and expenditures are vitally important to each and every Foxfire member. What I'd like to do is address questions that have been raised by two members in regards to Covenant 2.2 and bylaw 6.6. But before I do that, please consider these 3 points. One, committees and boards at Foxfire very definitely should and do have spending limitations. Two, as Chris has said earlier, in May, board members did some commentary on the Foxfire website that you should take a look at. Jim helped us understand the distinctions between covenants and bylaws. You can listen to that on the website. Jim pointed out that covenants deal with and control the way that land and buildings can and are to be used. Bylaws are a set of rules and procedures as to how Foxfire can and should operate. Now, there is a process in spending money. But there's a series of checks and balances that assure transparency and fostering open forums for members to weigh in with their feedback either at committee meetings as well as at board meetings. This process includes any expenditures over $25,000 require a minimum of 3 competitive bids. Now, the latter must be submitted to the Strategic Planning Committee for review and assignment of a project number. The proposals then go to the Finance Committee for review and determination of funding sources. Next, that proposal must be reviewed by administration to be sure all costs are included and that the project is appropriate for that particular season. Only then will the proposal reach the board for action. If the board approves the proposal, it is assigned a place on the 10-year rolling strategic plan. Covenant 2.2, dealing with alterations and additions to the common area, and bylaw 6.6, dealing with assessments which are needed to the common area, establish a check and balance on the board of directors as to spending as well. If the expenses exceed $500,000 in any one fiscal year, a member vote needs to be taken. If the cumulative, unusual, or unbudgeted expenses are below that $500,000 figure, the board may approve those projects. Members' questions raise their concerns about committee and board power to raise spending authority to 6.5% of total gross revenues for material alteration and/or substantial additions to the common areas. These clauses deal with aggregate spending in any one fiscal year for small projects that are unusual, unexpected, unbudgeted, or non-recurring. This added spending increase does not deal with large projects of $500,000 or above. Projects like irrigation proposals for a golf course, a building of a fitness center, a significant change to the clubhouse, etc. Those large projects need a vote by all members in the new bylaws. I'm referencing a set of smaller projects that collectively may be raised during the fiscal year. During the course of any fiscal year, the board can and does find it necessary to meet unforeseen expenses for these smaller projects. Revised Covenant 2.2 and the attendant bylaw 6.6 seek to be certain that when unexpected projects do spring up, the board can take proactive care of the unforeseen items. These projects are identified as being reasonably necessary to protect, maintain, repair, replace, or ensure the common area in function, use, appearance, and boundaries. Now, this is done by tapping into capital improvement, capital repair and replacement funds, and/or operating funds. In our personal life, we all have some form of a budget. If our air conditioning unit broke down, or our car was in an accident, or water pipes broke in our condominium, villa, or veranda, none of which would have been budgeted, we would not say, gee, sorry, we're not going to move forward with this until a new budget cycle comes around. We would replace those items as quickly as possible, and we wouldn't be spreading the cost over 2 years. Now, currently on Foxfire revenues, in the aggregate, the board can exercise power to spend about $420,000 on all of these unusual projects in any one fiscal year. The covenant and bylaw change would increase the amount to spend for unforeseen projects to about $520,000 without prior membership approval. Just as we experience in each of our homes with aging facilities and grounds, Foxfire finds added needs to take care of common area issues. Future boards should not fall into the third or fourth quarter of a fiscal year and find that project that should be taken care of has to wait for a new budget year to tap into funds. Here are just a few recent examples that have been important to keep our common house in order, if you will. These types of unbudgeted issues can and do come up. In 2019, we found it necessary to replace a bridge on number 9 Red Golf Course. And we found it important to fix and repair a water line on 4 Blue, neither of which had been budgeted way back in 2018. We found making an investment in acoustical ceiling and wallboard within the clubhouse grill room to be a benefit. We chose to complete renovating pro shop and office area improvements during 2019. Added landscape plantings on the western fence line behind Foxmore condominiums, the Radio Road wall, and Davis Boulevard were placed in operation for all of us to enjoy. In 2020, water aerators and fountains were added to ponds. Technology purchases for food and beverage, pro shop, and golf course were needed. The Greens Committee has asked for $168,000 needed for bulkheads, green reshaping, a short course par 3 setup, and recontouring of bunkers on several holes to be completed this summer. This was brought up in May, and it was approved at the June board meeting. The master pool refurbishing was approved at the May board meeting. It will be under repair in July. All of these projects were approved in an open manner in full collaboration with committees, operations, and the board. Notices of these meetings have taken place for each of these plans. Now, importantly, if unforeseen funds are needed in one fiscal year totaling up to $520,000, if it was 6.5%, they would be invested in additions that improve productivity, physical and visual comfort, enhanced image, and quality improvements for membership's use, benefit, and enjoyment. These types of enhancements will grow in cost in coming years. Documents likely will not be updated again for the next 10 to 15 years. Now let me permit me to point out revised and amended bylaws demand proper notice of meetings and agendas. Section 3.3 specifies that all member meetings require 14 days advance notice. Section 4.8 stipulates that all meetings of the Board of Directors, except those governed by attorney-client privilege, shall be open to members and shall be posted conspicuously in the community at least 48 hours in advance. Section 6.6 mandates that whenever a special assessment will be considered, notice must be mailed, delivered, or electronically transmitted to members and posted conspicuously in the community or broadcast on closed circuit TV not less than 14 days before the meeting. These bylaws assure that each of us that no one is attempting to hide anything. No one is placing expenditures over a multiple year basis. And certainly no one is trying to exclude any member or group of members from voicing their views. Your views are needed. The beliefs and practices of Foxfire's committees and boards, past, present, and in the future, have an obligation to two important items. They need to, one, control costs, and we need to make certain that we're building our capital reserves. What was adequate 35 years ago is not adequate today. We need to provide future boards with the flexibility to respond to unanticipated needs. Now, we can best accomplish that by establishing a dynamic and strong balance sheet for capital improvement, capital repair and replacement, and for the facilities and common groundwork that needs to be done. In the process, we will create satisfaction and enjoyment for members today. Secondly, we'll build a stronger Foxfire for members. Third, we'll bolster members' real estate investment and attract new members who are interested in buying in Foxfire. Four, we'll support unforeseen operations issues that need work in the future. And five, we'll more readily be prepared to fund incremental improvements in the community. The results will be a greater return on investment for each of us in our personal and community real estate. And we all want and have a stake in seeing Foxfire real estate grow in value over the next 5 to 10 years. As we have all learned in school and athletics programs, those of you who went through the arts, military service, companies, our jobs, and from our own families, if we're not moving ahead, we're falling behind. These amended documents had the imprint of all of Foxfire's board members who membership has elected. We embarked on the journey some 18 months ago in order to support the Foxfire community needs for today and over the next 10 years. They can be used in friendship and trust by you and future members who may occupy our homes. Make use of them. They'll help assure Foxfire isn't standing still and that it remains dynamic and a growing community on into the future. Next up will be Jim Moore.
Thanks, Roger. Greetings and good afternoon to all my friends and fellow members of Foxfire from Wisconsin, where I'm sitting right now. My name is Jim Moore. I'm a member of Foxfire's board of directors, and I'm also an attorney. Friends, there are lots of reasons to vote for the document revisions. Among others, it enables electronic voting in the future if people care to participate in electronic voting, brings us into compliance with Florida law. But perhaps the most important reason to approve these revisions is what I'm going to talk about, the improvement to our voting procedure here at Foxfire. There are lots of armchair critics in Foxfire with lots of ideas who write lots of emails. Many of them don't particularly like change and are willing to say anything to prevent it. Even some of the statements that are made are not correct. They will tell you that these revisions will take away your voting rights or that they will destroy majority rule. For example, one email I received just the other day finished with this inaccurate statement, and I'm quoting, "A no vote on the new governing documents ensures majority rule at Foxfire." Well, I'm sorry to state, putting it charitably, that's just incorrect. The revisions not only preserve majority rule, they make it stronger. They do not take away your voting rights. They make them stronger. They give you more of a say in the decisions of Foxfire. Now, I'm going to explain that, but before I get to the topic of voting thresholds, let me just ask you a question. When you vote in an election or a referendum, which side wins? Well, it's fairly obvious. It's the one that gets the most votes, right? That's the American way, and frankly, that's the way it's done everywhere. Do the people who don't vote get a say? No. And that's also the American way. If you want to make a choice, you vote. If you don't care, you don't vote. But in two specific areas here at Foxfire, based on our old bylaws, that's not quite the way it works. Those areas are those dealing with special assessments or with expansions of or additions to the common areas. In those two areas, when we vote at Foxfire, if you decide you don't care enough to vote, it's actually counted as a no. A majority of members can vote for something and still lose because of all those no votes from people who didn't care enough to vote. That's because the current documents in those areas require a majority of everyone to approve, not just the people who vote, but a majority of everyone. Just imagine an election where 50% of the total electorate turns out. Now, that's not unusual. That's common in many elections in the United States. In that case, for someone to get elected or someone, an item to be approved in a referendum, everyone would have to vote for the same person, or everyone would have to vote for the question for it to pass. If less than 50% of an electorate voted, no one would ever get elected, and nothing would ever pass because 50% of the total electorate could not possibly be achieved. That's why in America, we do not count those who choose not to vote. Now, the critics of these revisions want you to be hamstrung by all of those who don't vote. The board's revisions want to empower your vote by making sure that only those who care enough to vote are counted. Now, let me talk about the thresholds, which is the topic I'm to talk about. In most organizations around the world, before a vote is valid, a minimum number of people have to participate in the vote. That's what's known as a quorum. Foxfire's quorum, or the first threshold I'm talking about, used to be 33%, but because of a change in Florida law, a quorum now is 30%. That's the first threshold. At least 30% of Foxfire members, or at least 280 members, which is 30%, have to vote for the vote to be valid. That's simply Florida law. Now, the authors of these revisions that we're talking about were concerned about the concept of what I refer to as a runaway minority. So they built a second threshold as a safeguard to our members and residents. Let me explain that. Theoretically, if 280 people vote in one of these elections or referenda here at Foxfire, the vote is valid because a quorum was achieved. That is, 280 people is the minimum number under the first threshold that has to vote under Florida law for the vote to be valid. So if 280 people vote, a significant matter could be approved by theoretically by 141 members. That would be perfectly valid and legal. But the authors of these revisions thought that there should be some more protection on decisions dealing with these special assessments or addition to the common area. So they built in another threshold, another protection for the members. They said the minimum number of votes or the minimum threshold that needs to be obtained in those two areas is 366. That number represents a majority of all members here at Foxfire who usually vote. For example, in any given election here at Foxfire, about 200 to 225 people simply don't vote. That means about 731 members, or 931 units minus the 200 who don't vote, 731 members actually care enough about Foxfire to vote. 366 is a majority of those. So not only does the majority rule prevail under the revisions, contrary to what some of the critics have been writing, but your vote takes on more significance because we've stopped the practice of allowing people to ignore their obligation to vote and still be counted and registered as a no vote. Now, under the revisions, only those of you who actually read, study, and care enough about the issues to vote will be the ones who decide. You will no longer be hamstrung or held hostage by those who don't care and whose vote automatically is treated as a no. Under the revisions, your vote now means more and carries more weight. And because of that second threshold I talked about, the 366 minimum, you'll also be protected from the concept or the possibility of a runaway minority. And by the way, all the requirements about notices, evaluations, postings, right to speak, and all of the protections that Roger talked about in his presentation to you, all those safeguards that are built in to check and balance the decisions of the board of directors, those all remain the same. None of them will be changed. You will still have all those protections. When I was campaigning in January for this position on the board of directors, the question I was asked most by members in all the meetings I attended is, how can a voting system like we have at Foxfire exist? How can a system which lets people who don't even vote be registered as a no vote? I told them that this was written into the old bylaws, I don't know how many, 30 some years ago, and may have made sense back then. But I told those members who thought that the system should be changed that they would soon have that opportunity to change it. Well, this is your opportunity. Make your votes count. Don't be hamstrung or held hostage by people who don't vote. Don't be swayed by those critics. Your vote and your decision will matter more than ever. Those who care enough to vote will now have the right to control the destiny of Foxfire. Please vote for these revisions. This is your chance to correct that old system and make Foxfire more of a democracy. Regardless of how you feel about the other changes and revisions that are proposed, this change alone, this one change to that voting procedure, is so important to correct an undemocratic system that you should support and vote for the revisions for this reason alone. Of course, I'm not saying that there aren't many other good changes. There are plenty of good changes built into those revisions, but this is probably the most important and the most needed change. That's why the board voted to recommend these revisions. And that's why you should vote for and please support the revision. Now I'm going to turn the microphone back to our Vice President, Tappy Phillips, who will talk a little bit about special members meetings.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was great. Okay, one of the other changes in the revised documents is the petition for special meetings. This is section 3.2 of the proposed bylaws. This changes the requirement for signatures on a petition to call for a special meeting of members. Currently, it's 10%. The proposal would be to go to 25%. This prevents a small percentage of members from calling a special meeting, which can be time-consuming and expensive, as we've seen. A good example was the petition for the board to reconsider the location of the temporary bocce court last year. Under the current requirement, 10%, or 94 members, had to sign the petition. In this case, 162 members signed it. We mailed notices to the entire membership, incurred significant legal expenses, and required the time of the board, the administration staff, and the food and beverage staff. In the end, 42 people showed up, 238 short of a quorum. We were not able to hold the meeting. That cost the members about $7,000, plus the time of the staff, which could have been spending that time doing their jobs. The bocce court itself cost only $14,000. This was a waste of time and member money. We feel that requiring 25% is a more realistic number and still gives members the opportunity to bring the board and the membership together to address concerns. Thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Cornetta, and he's going to answer your questions.
Very well, thank you, Tappy. We have received a few questions from members, and Lynn, this is one I might address to you. The member asks, since our actual 10-year average increase in annual assessments is only 2.4%, why does the board want to increase this to 6.5%?
Dr. Cornetta, this is Jim Moore. I have trouble hearing you, and I wonder if you might lean a little closer to the microphone and restate that question.
I will, and I apologize. A member asks, since our actual 10-year average increase in annual assessments is only 2.4%, why does the board want to increase this to 6.5%? And I think this is a question appropriate for Lynn.
Okay. The 6.5%, as we mentioned before, is a percentage that is the limit that we can increase based upon budgeted revenues and budgeted capital contributions. The prior boards have averaged 2.4%, but keeping that higher percentage allows future boards the flexibility to add a golf course reserve fund, which many members have expressed a desire for that type of reserve. It allows future boards the flexibility not to increase annual assessments in 1 year, but double them up in the next year. And the board has done that twice in the last 10 years. It also would give the future boards the flexibility to borrow money and increase annual assessments to cover the debt service costs.
Okay, well, thank you. Lynn, this is another question for you. It says, why does the board want to increase the annual assessments to 6.5% when the inflation rate over the last 10 years was only a maximum of 3.2%?
That goes back again to that the 6.5% is a percent of gross revenues and capital contributions. It's not a year-over-year change, like inflation is year-over-year change. But Foxfire's actual year-over-year change in the last 10 years was 3.8%. Now, as we've talked about earlier, annual assessments include capital contributions to reserves and for maintenance fees to cover operating costs. So if we would isolate the change in the annual assessment for only maintenance fees, our Foxfire's 10-year average increase was 2.8%, which is very much in line with the 10-year average increase in inflation. And the 2.8% for maintenance fees, that covers things like our payroll and our golf course maintenance, et cetera. So I do think that we have been in line with inflation. For next year, we are proposing a 2.3% increase of the maintenance fees, also in line. So I do think that Foxfire has done a good job matching our costs to inflation rates and keeping them as low as they could. I hope that answers the member's question.
Thank you, Lynn. Roger, here's a question for you. If members will only vote on special assessments over 6.5% of revenues and capital contributions, won't the board be able to undertake major projects without member knowledge or understanding?
Good question and an important one. The short answer, no. As I said earlier, and as Jim Moore had echoed as well, there's a whole series of checks and balances that have been established within the covenants and within the bylaws and within our operating practices. As I said earlier, every project above $25,000 requires a minimum of 3 competitive bids. Then it goes to the strategic planning committee. Then it goes to the finance committee. Then it goes to the administration committee, long before it comes to the board. The checks and balances are built in there for a purpose, to help us grow revenues and to help us grow our capital reserve funds and protect membership's investments overall. The boards aren't going to take, future boards, and certainly not this current board, are going to try to take advantage and raise big projects. Big projects need the vote of the entire membership.
Okay, well, thank you, Roger. We're approaching the 45-minute time limit for our webinar. So that's all the questions we'll answer at this point. Any additional questions we've received, we will post on the Foxfire webpage after the webinar is completed. I want to thank the 64 members who took the time to attend this webinar. I hope you've come away with a broader understanding of the proposed changes to our documents, the reasons for the changes, and the safeguards protecting your rights as members. We encourage you not only to vote, but to vote in favor of these document revisions. We believe these changes are in the best interest of Foxfire and give present and future boards the tools necessary to ensure that Foxfire is a secure and modern community, adaptable to changing times and attractive to current and future members. I want to thank all our panelists for explaining so clearly the particular revisions each one addressed. And finally, I want to recognize Christine Safranik and Kathy O'Brien of the Communications Committee, who did so much work organizing this webinar and coordinating the efforts of our panel. A sincere thank you to both of them. Again, I thank all of you as participants. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and please stay safe. Thank you so much.